So building capacity for cultural humility in cross-racial spaces, session 2 is what we'll be doing today. And although this is a presentation that is done for INTAC, it's under a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA, the human, with the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And all of these materials as a partnership with our partners from Resilient Futures is doesn't reflect SAMHSA. We are a multidisciplinary team of organizations that have come together to ensure that children and families are able to get the best possible mental health care available. We have partners like the Change Matrix, CARS, the Center for Applied Research and Solutions at Georgetown. The center is also a part of who we are, the Center for Child Development. Also, we have FREDLA, which is a really important part of who we are, and that is the Family Run Executive Director Leadership Program Association. And what they do is, in system of care, it's so important to have, as you know, the voice of family. And it's a wonderful resource for family members to have a support in attending meetings and all of the other wonderful things that they do. We also have Youth Move. And again, being able to have youth voice that not only partners with us, but helps guide us in the things that we develop is really important. And so they're all right there, and the American Academy of Pediatrics is also another wonderful supporter. Our goal, as I mentioned, is all children, youth, young adults with emotional or behavioral needs can get access to evidence-based treatment and recovery service within the system of care. Examples include state and local agency leaders. We love working with them, mental health workforces, primary care providers, school workforce, community-based providers, and again, as I mentioned earlier, certainly not least, but equally, peer supervisors, family partners, and youth partners. This is a really colorful and wonderful illustration of what we do here at INTAC. And so the development of practical tools, that technical assistance side of what we do. We have a 5 Things Digest that we put out. We have training academies. And so really, if you are not sure whether or not we have something for you, hit us up on by email or through any of the other forms that you do, and we'll be able to have a discussion with you. And chances are, if not us, we'll be able to find a person, but more often than not, we're able to hew out some answers or some support for you. And this is who we are. Myself, Dr. Laura Cahill, Dr. Laura MacArthur, and Gia Kelly, my colleague here at INTAC. And so before we get started, what I'd like to do is to say a few words about this format. Dr. Cahill and Dr. MacArthur have really given a great deal of thought into how do you transition an intimate presentation or session into a vehicle like Zoom, where people are in their own homes, in their own camera. And so one of the things that I would like to ask is that in order to get the most from this is, first of all, as we do the breakout sessions, please be sure to participate in that. It's also very important that you also have your camera on. And sometimes it's easy not to do that. And it's something that we really think would add value to the process. And I want to make sure that we have time, but I don't know if you can go to your view and do a gallery view, but if you could put your view on gallery view. Before we start, this stuff for some people can be a little heavy. I'm going to tell this dad joke. It's real quick. Some people will get it, some people will not. Now, hopefully you can see the You're in the gallery view. Are people able to see the gallery view? Here's the joke. What did the mother kangaroo say to her friends when it started to rain? I wish the weather would clear up. I hate it when Joey and his friends play inside. Rim shot. Now, think about your response to that joke. What would people see? Would they see a gasp? Would they see a chuckle? Those are those nonverbals that are just so important to this type of work. And depending on who you talk to or what research you go to, it may be 70 to 90% of communication is nonverbal. I offer that up as an example of it's really important that we're able to share those nonverbals doing this work. So with that, I will yield to our colleagues from Resilient Futures, and I thank you for your patience and your...
Thank you so much, Mike. That was a great starting point for us today, and I appreciate seeing so many faces on my screen now that I have that gallery view. Thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. I'm Dr. Laura MacArthur, and I'm here along with Dr. Ellie Cahill, and I'm going to get us started today. So today we are going to be continuing our 4-part series, as Mike said, around building capacity for cultural humility in cross-racial spaces. Session 1, we did an overview of cultural humility, and today we're really leaning into that first tenet of cultural humility around critical self-reflection and lifelong learning.
So we want to begin by sharing a quote from a text that we actually often use with our school partners. And it's a book called Unconscious Bias in Schools. And it's actually, if you have not read it, it's a great text that's actually written by a cross-racial team of authors. So Tracy Benson identifies as a Black male, and he is a school leader, as is Sarah Fireman, is also a school leader who happens to be a white woman. And what they talk about, I'm just going to read this quote. They say that the most important step, referring to equity work, is to give ourselves and our colleagues permission to be learners. As we begin trying to address racism in ourselves and our systems, we need to agree to try and mess up and try again. It's no secret that talking across race about race is a minefield. Just one negative experience in this minefield, or the fear of one, is enough to deter even those with the strongest commitments. And then they ask us this question: are we willing to make those mistakes in the interest of making that progress? And what we love about this quote is it's just so boldly honest about what often happens in cross-racial spaces when we try to do equity work. We make a mistake, we all make a mistake, and then we get into this kind of paralyzed place that we're scared to move forward, because we are so concerned about causing harm or being seen in whatever way we might be seen, that often those really difficult moments end up stopping the work entirely. So we're going to sit in and think about this space and thinking about this question as we begin our session today, really thinking about what is it like to stay in this space, even when it's difficult. And interestingly, both Tracy and Sarah, as co-authors of the text, actually name the challenges that came up as a cross-racial team, even writing a book together about race. So I encourage you to look at this book, and we're going to move into a connection circle that Laura is going to lead us through.
You may remember from session 1, we often and typically always start with some sort of connection activity, usually connection circle. And today we're going to do it a little bit differently. We are going to go into small groups. And I encourage you to remember Mike's words around, we really want to support and encourage your participation in this. So this connection circle prompt is to share a time when you have made a mistake that led to personal growth or change.
So the key learning points to today's session really revolve around that first tenet of cultural humility. We gave an overview in our session 1, that tenet of lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. So you'll already notice that we started that process of self-reflection by giving you a chance to share in those smaller connection circles. The goal today is to really increase your awareness of racialized experiences for young children. What do those look like? And often there's a sense that young children don't have racialized experiences that they can articulate, but we know that that's not true. So we're going to lean into what that looks like. We're going to talk a little bit more about privilege and understand the ways that we all hold some kinds of privilege. In addition, we want to spend some time gaining an awareness of implicit bias and our own implicit bias. And then finally, we'll close with working through understanding what is allyship as a journey. What does that look like to truly be an ally?
Also want to just refresh you on our shared agreements that we use for facilitating spaces like this. And so just want to remind you of a few pieces here. One, to honor our space and maintain confidentiality. I don't know if there are any shared relationships here, but whether there are not, the stories that might be shared with you in our self-reflection spaces can be really powerful. And we encourage you to take the learning and leave the stories, meaning, leaving the identities and details behind and take the learning from those stories with you. We really hope you can all be as fully present as possible and knowing kind of where you're at today, knowing what might help you stay attentive and engaged, and noticing kind of, throughout the session, just how you're feeling, and if you need to, kind of adjust anything for you to be able to both be able to pay attention and care for yourself. What we say matters. We really try to encourage ourselves and everyone else to use language that's inclusive and expands our thinking, that honors the diverse experiences and perspectives. And in all of our agreements, we sometimes, get into discussion around trauma-informed work requires discussions around trauma. And so sometimes these topics are triggering, and just want to, let you know that, and to encourage you to take care of yourself if the content triggers you, and to reach out to one of us or a trusted person in your own life if you need any support in managing response to any of that content.
So again, we have additional agreements that we use with our equity work. Again, recognizing that we all enter. Some of you have been doing equity work for many, many years. Some of us are newer to the work. And so recognizing that we have varying levels of knowledge and understanding, and that our own personal experiences do influence how we make sense of information and how we internalize that. Again, especially in our small group discussions, our breakout rooms, we'll have a few sessions today, breakout sessions. We really want to assume positive intent and create spaces that it's okay and safe to ask questions. We'll have an open mind. But in particular, we really are inviting you to stay engaged. And so please, if there's a reason you can't join a breakout room, something's come up, send us a quick note if you have to step out. But we're really asking that you're engaged in those breakout sessions. And some of these topics are difficult, particularly as we lean into those places that maybe it feels like you're walking in a minefield when you're having that conversation about maybe implicit bias or these difficult things. So the invitation is to experience that discomfort and sit with it versus, hey, this is a good time for me to go get lunch. I'm going to pop off the call, or just being really quiet because you're concerned. We really want you to stay in the space, speak your truth, your own experiences versus speaking for other people. Again, accepting that short workshop, this is part 2 of a 4-part series, and even then it won't be fully closed. And so expect that this is ongoing work. It's lifelong work. And again, we've said it before, but while all aspects of equity are really important for this conversation and our work and space today, we are going to be isolating race. We'll be leaning into a little bit more that faith and confidence article that we gave you for homework, which does speak specifically to a Black African-American experience for children. But that doesn't mean that we're not holding account all races, but we are really speaking about race today. And some of our content today, in particular with that article, will be focused on the experience of Black children. And so we just want to name that as we do the work today.
Thank you. So refresher and reminder about what we're talking about in this first tenet of cultural humility, which is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. It's in this tenet, in this space, where we really make space to acknowledge that our experiences differ based on our racial and cultural identities and the circumstances that created our worldview. And that we start to engage in curiosity and commit to the lifelong learning journey that Ellie was talking about around race-based equity, to really kind of work with some acceptance around the fact that there's no sort of endpoint of this series where you will have reached, some end of the journey or mountaintop around, a finality around learning in this area, that this really is lifelong learning. And so much of it has to do with reflecting on our own selves and the lenses and experiences that we bring into this work and into every space that we work in. Thank you, everyone. We're going to shift into our next section around understanding privilege. So our next slide is really dense. I'm going to walk us through it slowly. We're going to encourage you to reflect and think of examples. This is from Peggy McIntosh's, writing around the knapsack of privilege. And she's writing here specifically around white privilege, but also naming that this can apply to other aspects of privilege too. And privilege is, one of the biggest things that shapes our worldview, right? Shapes the way that we see things, which means it also shapes some of our biases, which we'll get into next. And so I want to just walk us through these quotes, because I think there's a lot of pieces here that really get that self-reflection going. She writes, "I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. So one of the things about privilege is we're being taught not to see it where we have it. And that's how the systems uphold themselves, right? So it does take this really, intentional self-reflection to start to see all the different ways that it can show up. So what she says next is, so I've begun in an untutored way to ask what it is like to have white privilege. I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in every day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. So one of the biggest pieces for me in this second piece is the unearned assets, right? We've been sold this idea of meritocracy, which she gets into in the next paragraph. For me, white privilege has turned out to be an elusive and fugitive subject. The pressure to avoid it is great, for in facing it, I must give up the myth of the meritocracy. If these things are true, this is not such a free country. One's life is not what one makes it. Many doors open for certain people through no virtues of their own. I want you to just, sit with that for a minute and reflect on, what's coming up for you. What are some of the special provisions and maps, passports, code books, visas that you've been given, as these unearned privileges, these unearned assets?
And this is a really hard piece to reflect on, a time when you benefited from privilege, and also a time when you might have experienced oppression because of a lack of privilege. May have privilege that weighs differently depending on our race or our gender or ethnic identities or education, all of those things. We also know that it's often really hard, as Laura was saying, to identify our privilege, because we do have this myth of meritocracy. Well, I worked really hard for that, therefore it's not a privilege. But it's critical that we face our privileges as part of this work to recognize and challenge power imbalances. So just to give an example, of a place that, and we, in the breakout before, where you all were in your breakout rooms, I was sharing an example of my daughter. So I had shared about my brother, but an example with my daughter when she was in kindergarten, she was struggling to learn how to read. And I had requested an evaluation, and the school said, well, not all kids are, some kids just aren't that bright, and they didn't want to do an evaluation. And the privilege that I had in that moment was I was a clinical psychologist, and I had worked as a school psychologist, and I knew that legally, if I requested in writing an evaluation, even though they didn't believe that my daughter deserved an evaluation, they would have to do it. So I used this privilege that I had from my professional experience, having a doctorate and all of these things, to leverage the evaluation that my daughter needed, which actually ended up showing that she was twice exceptional. So she is severely dyslexic and gifted. But we never would have gotten there had I not used the privilege of my education and, used my title as a doctor and all of these things. And yes, I worked hard for my degree, but the things that happened, the experiences in my life that I had access to, even applying to college in the first place, I had a lot of privilege that let me get an undergraduate degree, which helps facilitate my process of getting my doctorate. So I had a lot of privilege in that experience. A time where I did not have privilege would be, for example, driving my car on a freeway in California and being pulled over for a broken taillight, and didn't matter that I was a doctor in that moment. I actually I had my twins. I have twin children, and they were about 6 months old at the time. And my car was, not only was I stopped, but my car was taken away, impounded, all for a broken taillight. And I was literally left at the side of the road with 2 babies and no way to get home, because there was a white police officer who didn't care what I had to say in that moment. So blatant oppression related to my race. And there was a lack of privilege in that moment. It didn't matter any of my professional experience. All that they saw was the color of my skin. However, even in that, had I been a Black man, I probably would have been arrested. I don't think they would have just left me at the side of the road with my kids. So we name that as an example of, we all have moments of privilege, but also moments of oppression, and they are not weighed equally.
Thank you, Ellie. I was reflecting with a friend recently on my privilege as a white woman in clinical work, where I speak Spanish, and one of the feedback it is not perfect Spanish. It is, was learned mostly as an adult. And I get a lot of response from people, oh, your Spanish is so good, you're trying so hard. And her Spanish is much, much better than mine. And she's a woman of color. And she gets told all the time that her Spanish isn't good enough, or, gets commented by folks that she needs to work on it. And, there's, a lot of different pieces going on there around race, ethnicity, and language. But being seen as a white person who's showing up and trying versus seeing, a person of color who's not doing good enough. And then, a time where I think, I was thinking about this experience of, I was testifying in front of the Colorado legislature around the need for continuing ed credits for psychologists. And so a lot of privilege got me in that door to be part of that testimony. But the person who was arranging it and calling us all up to speak, there were 5 psychologists, 2 men and 3 women. He addressed both men as Dr. So-and-so, and addressed all 3 women by our first names. All of us have the same credentials, PhDs in clinical psychology. And this man very clearly did not see the women in that experience as having the same level of experience, did not see us as having the need to be addressed by the doctor title in the same way that he addressed the men. So this quote talks about how the first step to defeating our hidden biases is to be honest with ourselves about the blind spots we have. And having a bias is only human. The only shame is in making no effort to improve. So there are, elements here of that what we started with, right? That the work really is about looking at these hard things and figuring out kind of what to do with it. And so how do we dismantle implicit bias? Well, first we have to recognize what it is and when it's happening. In our next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. But once we do, it's really a process around learning how to calm your brain, or mindfulness or some other self-regulation strategy, so that you can, as you recognize when it's happening, you have some strategies at hand to kind of sit with that, to set an intention around engaging in self-examination without shame, without coming down, necessarily really hard on yourself, but just really being able to take into consideration your racial and cultural frames of reference and how they're showing up for you in that moment. And I'll give you a quick example. I was with a friend recently who is a Black man, and I've been going through quite a bit of grief in my own life, and we were somewhere public, and I was crying about what was happening in my life. And he very kindly said to me, I really want to support you and be here for you right now, but it's not safe for me as a Black man in public to be sitting with a white woman who's crying. And I really had to stop and think about the blind spot that was showing up for me in that moment, of really not having an awareness of, in that moment, what might possibly happen if folks see a Black man sitting next to a white woman crying, and what could possibly come out of a situation like that in terms of harm for him. And so, really, one of those shocking moments, and then sitting with that, thinking about what I had missed in that, and, really appreciating the opportunity that I was given in that moment to think about what I had missed in that. And I think those moments come, sometimes come up when you're, I was not in a regulated state when it was happening, but I was able to hear it and process it and work through it both then and later, to understand more of my own, frame of reference and how that was shaping that experience for the both of us in really different ways.
For sharing that. I appreciate that example. When we think about implicit bias, we're really, or it's sometimes called unconscious bias, we're really talking about biases in judgment or behavior that result from these really subtle cognitive processes that operate really at or even below that conscious level of awareness. And they're without our intentional control. So Laura talked about a blind spot. They're things that we're not recognizing, but they really are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding or our actions or our decisions in an unconscious manner. And they relate to biases around race and culture and language and physical ability, sexual orientation, all of those things. And we engage in them. There's a lot of research that it really is rooted in neuroscience. It's a way that our brains, it's related to the ways that we make shortcuts and how we process information. So implicit bias is not the same as explicit bias, right? We're not talking about specific attitudes or beliefs that you hold on a conscious level. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these things that happen that we're not even aware of, that really are ways that we take in information, and that's related to differences that we're not consciously bringing into our awareness and understanding. And we all have these spaces of implicit bias. And so we really want to pay attention to and be aware of where is that happening for us. So for example, oh yes, it's a great example, thinking under the influence. Yeah, because it's under our cognitive level or our space. And so an example of an implicit bias, well, that example around language might be, if someone assumes that a person of color, a Latinx person, should speak fluent Spanish, and many of us do not. I am a Latina that does not speak Spanish. I have very limited Spanish, less than Laura. But there's an assumption that folks might make that I would speak fluent Spanish. And that would be a bias, right? That is based on stereotypes that affect an understanding. It may not be intentional or a conscious level, but it's nonetheless something that happens. So we really want to pay attention and check those biases, again, bringing them to our awareness so that we can make a plan to improve and mitigate those biases. Let's go to the next slide.
So implicit bias shows up whether we know it or not. This is, the goal is to know it and see it when it shows up and be open to hearing about it when others see it. But it shows up all the time in early childhood communities, as I'm sure a lot of you know and have numerous examples. What we've seen, a lot of the research that's come out around implicit bias in early childhood education show is that one area where it shows up is in connection and rapport building. So teachers who are unable and really not putting in the same kind of energy to engage children of color in a culturally meaningful way, the way they engage with white children. We see lower expectations academically, behaviorally, emotionally, that teachers hold, that early childhood caregivers and educators hold for children of color. We see the types of materials in classrooms really biased towards white children, towards the white nuclear family kind of experience in terms of the books, the artwork on the walls, the dolls, the toys, the figurines for the dollhouse, all kinds of ways that shows up. We often see implicit bias show up in who we help. Who are we willing to give that extra time to and put in that extra energy? Do that one-on-one check-in with every day. Hold that consistent, supportive response. And so, as implicit bias can show up in who we don't help, I think this one is sometimes harder to see, like, oh, that teacher's doing such a great job with that student. And then there might be another student, a student of color in the classroom with very similar behaviors who's not getting that level of support. And then we also see adultification, and this is when teachers, adults look at students who are taller or bigger for their age, that are students of color, and they expect them to be farther along developmentally than they are, and they treat them with those expectations. And Ellie and I were just having a chat about this the other day because we were talking about a young child of color that is in our lives who is in this situation, who's quite big for the young little guy that he is. And I was talking about a young white child about the same age in my life who's also very similar. He's 2 wearing 4T. I think that's about kind of where they're both at, right? And his family has expressed no concerns about how he'll be treated in his childcare, preschool, daycare setting, whereas the family of color has a lot of fear and anxiety around what will happen for this young 2-year-old who looks a couple years older because of this adultification phenomenon that happens. And then, of course, there are all kinds of ways that this can show up in the classroom. And if you've read or heard anything by Dr. Bettina Love, she talks about it as spirit murdering, right? What happens when a child is never called on in class? Does that invalidate their belief in themselves, right? Bring out some of their own self-doubt, sends a message to other students about how that child is to be treated. And so many, so just touching on it really, but there are so many other ways too that implicit bias can show up in our ECU communities. And this work really does start with us, right? Where do ours show up? And next week we're going to really look at us and what do we do, right, when we have one of those moments? And I might notice it in myself, or I might notice it in a colleague, and then how do we have those conversations and how do we shift that thinking and those practices?
So the last part of our session today is really thinking about what is allyship as a verb, as an active practice. And the first piece is that allies are people who recognize the unearned privilege they receive from society's patterns of injustice, right? So we have privilege because there is someone on that side of injustice. That is where we land with that privilege, and take responsibility for changing those patterns. So an example actually of this to some degree is the founding of Resilient Futures. So part of the piece that Laura and our other colleague Megan and I knew when we started Resilient Futures was the work that we offered had been part of offered initially through a mental health model. And one of the things we knew was that people who were had refugee status, for example, or undocumented, did not feel safe accessing our the services, because in that mental health model, they had to actually sign up and register within a mental health system. And we recognize that the unearned privilege of people who were born in the United States can access care like that without the concern of alerting anyone to their citizenship status, right? And so there's a privilege to that. And we thought, how can we in part provide care in communities to families and caregivers, for example, that wasn't tied into a need to register or disclose that kind of information. And part of that was founding a nonprofit that wasn't connected to a mental health system. So that was a way that we were actively working to recognize that there's privilege that I can, if I want, I can go, go to a mental health clinic and get my therapy on and whatever I want to do. And I don't have that same concern around what does that mean for my citizenship status. Another part is one thing we can do in the face of burnout, right? In those systems of oppression is developing allyship so that you can make changes and see back to that article, that faith and confidence article. How do we not give up? How do we continue to believe that we can affect change? Allyship is a part of that practice. And again, it's a lifelong journey. So if you don't ever get to a place that like, I am solidly in this, like I am an ally and I'm great and I want to pat myself on the back. It's a journey of continued learning. And Laura's going to walk us through that.
Yeah, so there's so much out there about being an ally. What does it mean to be an ally? Can you call yourself an ally? Who's an ally? And there's a lot to unpack there. But I want to first just name this concept of performative allyship, because this can actually be really harmful when we center the conversation on the individual by using social and public relation recognition and clout. So this sort of white savior phenomenon, or this idea of see how woke I am or see what I did, rather than addressing social injustices and reform. And that kind of allyship, is not what we're talking about here. It lacks real commitment by the individual and shields them from exposure to any real personal risks. So a few things here, so first of all, there's some other terms, being used right now to accomplice, co-conspirator. There's a lot of different ways to talk about this concept, but the premise is, particularly for white allyship, if this is something you're striving for and your allyship is something you're actively practicing, you have to really think about what it is you can put on the line, where it is you can really have impact. And back to Bettina Love, who talks about this so beautifully. She talks about how white privilege is something that you can cash in over and over again every day. And so you can show up and put yourself out there and on the line in a way that people of color cannot. So it's really important to critically self-examine your motivations for wanting to be involved as an ally. Is it only because this is currently, a hot topic? And we've seen this happen over the last 2 years. We saw a huge movement around Black Lives Matter and protests, and people really actively engaging in protests around the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery back in 2020. And we saw at Resilient Futures an influx of schools who we'd been trying for years to get involved in racial equity work, reaching out, asking for the work, in ways they never had before. And subsequently, since then, we've also seen a dropping off, right, from those individuals who were, actively wanting to address those injustices, and from the schools and the systems who, got caught up in that hot topic and have, subsequently moved away from it. Another reason, is only because you're being asked to participate by your institution. So we have been on that side of things too, working previously in a larger institution where we did require racial equity work from staff, and in particular white affinity groups, affinity groups for people of color. And we saw that, that if you're not ready to do the work, it doesn't matter how many of those groups you go to. Your practices won't shift, even though you might be able to say that you're actively working on it. And another thing I think we see a lot is, wanting others to think you're good, wanting to be the good white person, and wanting, to be the one that can get it right. And that actually just comes straight out of whiteness. Whiteness is all about, being good and perfect and getting things right and showing up in the right way. And that is something we have to really deconstruct as allies. Back to that first quote that we started with, is we have to be willing to show up and make mistakes and know that we're not going to get it right and we're not going to do perfect. And deconstructing our privilege and looking at being an active ally requires a lot more than that. And then I finally want to just give the example that Bettina Loves talks about, and there's a great video if you want to watch it, but she talks about, how a white person can literally put their life on the line, and police will not, respond in the same way as if it was a person of color. And so there's not necessarily those kinds of opportunities or things that we have to do, but she really talks about pushing yourself to think about, what do you have to put on the line? Where do you have a place to speak up, to act, to do something that's going to make a difference for people of color? So we're going to watch a quick video. Some of you may have seen this, and we'll discuss.
Very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up. And says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry Black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there, trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy, because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
We want you to think about, what does allyship like that look like in ECE communities? And as you think about that, we want to name that there is an intersection of age and race in early childhood communities, right? We're talking about very, very young children. And so there's inherently a power differential when we're talking about, a toddler, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, and the adults that are in that space, right? But there's also the dynamic of race. How can educators serve as allies to children in ECE communities? So think back, way back now to the beginning of where we started, and that article that I hope you had the opportunity to read that named those suspension rates. And we heard in this community, people who've had their own babies suspended 4 times in 1 month, right? How can we serve as allies to those children? We also want to ask 2 other questions for those of you who are white educators. How do you show up as an ally to educators of color? So not just to children and families, but your colleagues in your community. And then also for those of you who are educators of color, what is it that you need from your white allies? Right? So these are questions that we want you to be reflecting on and thinking about between now and our next session. And there's another piece of homework that Laura's going to walk you through. So it's thinking about these questions. And can we put the questions in the chat? Because this is part of your reflection between now and next week.
So our next 2 sessions, August 1st and August 8th, we'll go through the next 2 tenets of cultural humility. Thank you all so much for being here and for participating in all of our reflective content.
Thank you so much.